In 1890, one man controlled 90% of the American tobacco market. He did not smoke, he did not chew, he simply owned the air you breathed. James Buchanan Duke built an empire on a machine that could roll 200 cigarettes a minute at a time when the world was still rolling them by hand. But the most terrifying part of his story is not the monopoly he built. It is the secret document he signed in 1911 that effectively turned the United States government into his personal collection agency. This is the dark history of the man who invented the modern addiction and the cold, calculated mechanics of the American Tobacco Company. To understand the American Tobacco Company history, you have to understand the void left by the American Civil War. This is the James Buchanan Duke biography that the history books often sanitize. He was the Duke University founder history forgets to mention as a predator of the Industrial Revolution monopolies. He changed the history of cigarette marketing by realizing that you do not sell a product, you sell a craving. This is how he mastered the tobacco industry monopoly. The South was a graveyard of broken dreams after the Civil War. The air smelled of ash and desperation. James Duke grew up in the red clay dirt of North Carolina. His father, Washington Duke, had returned from the war with nothing but 2 blind mules and a single bag of tobacco. That was the family's entire net worth. They lived in a log cabin that felt more like a cage. But James did not want a farm. He did not want the slow, rhythmic life of a planter. He wanted a factory. He wanted a machine that never slept. While his competitors were focused on the quality of the leaf, Duke was focused on the speed of the kill. He realized early on that hand rolling was a bottleneck for profit. A skilled worker could roll perhaps 4 cigarettes in a minute. It was an artisanal process. It was slow. It was expensive. Duke hated slow. In 1884, he took a massive gamble on a prototype machine invented by a teenager named James Bonsack. It was a mechanical monster. It was temperamental. It broke down constantly. Other tobacco barons laughed at it. They called it a toy. Duke saw what they did not. He saw an infinite supply. The Bonsack machine could do the work of 48 skilled rollers. It could produce 120,000 cigarettes in a single day. Suddenly, Duke had more product than the world had cravings. He had a surplus that threatened to drown his own company. He did not just need customers. He needed to create an itch that only he could scratch. He needed to re-engineer the human brain. In the late 19th century, cigarette smoking was considered effeminate. Real men chewed tobacco or smoked cigars. Duke decided to change the definition of masculinity. He spent 20% of his gross revenue on marketing. In the 19th century, that was unheard of. It was considered corporate suicide. He flooded the streets with trading cards. He put pictures of actresses and athletes inside every pack. He was buying the minds of the public before they even knew they were for sale. He was not just a businessman, he was a psychological architect. He sent scouts to every corner of the globe. He gave away millions of cigarettes for free in China, just to get a population of 400 million people hooked on the __quote_0__. He understood the math of addiction long before the scientists did. If you can control the supply and manufacture the demand, you do not have a business. You have a printing press for money. Duke's office in New York was not a place of luxury. It was a war room. He sat there, surrounded by ledgers, calculating the exact moment his rivals would break. He was a man of cold habits and zero empathy. He looked at a map of the United States and saw a series of fortresses that needed to be razed. He was ready to go to war. He didn't want a seat at the table. He wanted to own the table, the chairs, and the room they sat in. The gamble on the Bonsack machine had paid off. He had the lowest production costs in the history of the industry. He could produce 1,000 cigarettes for less than the price of a single cigar. This gave him a weapon that no one else possessed, the ability to lose money longer than anyone else. He was about to unleash a wave of predatory pricing that would reshape the American economy forever. He was no longer a farm boy from North Carolina. He was the architect of a new kind of tyranny, one that came wrapped in paper and lit with a match. But as the smoke began to clear, the world realized that Duke wasn't just building a company. He was building a trap. And once you were inside, there was no way out. The competition was about to learn that in James Duke's world, you either became a part of the machine or you were crushed by it. He was moving from the factory floor to the boardroom, and he was bringing a sledgehammer with him. Chapter 2: Building the Monopoly. James Duke did not want to lead the tobacco market. He wanted to be the tobacco market. He viewed competition not as a challenge, but as a systematic error that needed to be deleted from the American economy. By 1885, his factory was churning out millions of cigarettes that nobody had asked for. The market was saturated. The shelves were full. Most men would have slowed down production. Duke did the opposite. He accelerated. He understood a fundamental law of predatory capitalism. If you cannot find a door, you break down the wall. He began by weaponizing his balance sheet. Duke launched a scorched earth price war that made the industry tremble. He would identify a city where a local manufacturer was thriving. Then he would flood that specific city with his own brands, slashing the price to 3 cents a pack. This was well below the cost of the paper and the leaf. He was intentionally losing money on every single sale. His rivals watched in horror as their customers vanished overnight. They couldn't compete with a man who was willing to go bankrupt just to see them starve. But Duke wasn't going bankrupt. He was using the massive profits from his established territories to subsidize his local massacres. It was a mathematical execution. One by one, the regional kings of tobacco fell. When they were at their weakest, Duke would walk into their offices with a contract and a cold smile. He offered them a choice: sell your company to me for pennies on the dollar, or continue this war until you have nothing left to feed your children. Most chose the pennies. He wasn't just buying factories, he was buying silence and removing threats. By 1890, the 4 largest cigarette manufacturers in the United States were exhausted. They realized that fighting James Duke was like trying to punch a tidal wave. They agreed to a merger on his terms. The result was the American Tobacco Company. It was a $25 million behemoth that instantly controlled 90% of the market. But for Duke, 90% was still 10% too little. He turned his gaze toward the entire supply chain. This was the birth of total vertical integration, a strategy so aggressive it bordered on the illegal. He realized that to control the cigarette, he had to control everything that touched it. He bought the companies that manufactured the tinfoil. He bought the companies that processed the licorice used for flavoring. He even bought the forests to control the wood for the crates. If you were a small independent manufacturer trying to survive, you suddenly found that you couldn't buy paper. You couldn't find flavoring. The very air of the industry had been sucked out of the room. Duke owned the lungs of the trade. Then came the retail stranglehold. Duke pioneered the exclusive dealer agreement. He approached shopkeepers with a simple, brutal ultimatum. If they wanted to carry his most popular, heavily advertised brands, the ones every customer was asking for, they had to agree to a terrifying condition. They were forbidden from displaying or promoting any product made by his remaining competitors. He turned every corner store in America into a private showroom for the American Tobacco Company. If a shopkeeper refused, Duke would simply fund a new tobacco shop right across the street and sell his goods at half price until the rebel was out of business. By the turn of the century, Duke had a $50 million war chest. He had crushed the American spirit of competition and replaced it with a monolithic machine. He sat at the center of a web that reached into every pocket and every lung in the country. but his thirst was not quenched. He looked across the Atlantic at the British market, a place of tradition and old-fashioned business ethics. He saw it not as a peer, but as a fresh carcass. He prepared his private rail car and his army of lawyers. He was moving on London, and he intended to treat the British Empire with the same cold, calculated cruelty he had shown the farmers of North Carolina. The world was about to learn that James Duke didn't just want your money, he wanted your submission. James Duke lived like a king who expected a revolution at any moment. He did not build a home, he built a fortress of marble and gold on Fifth Avenue. It was a palace designed to scream one thing to the old money elite of New York. I have arrived, and I own you. The mansion was a 54-room monument to ego. It sat on the corner of 78th Street. It was a place where the air felt heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and the cold weight of absolute power. But Duke was not a man of the ballroom. He was a man of the ledger. He found the high society of the Gilded Age to be a tedious waste of capital. While the Astors and the Vanderbilts were busy competing over who could throw the most lavish costume ball, Duke was in his study. He was counting. He was calculating. He was looking for the next zero. He was a man of cold, mechanical habits. He did not care for the approval of the blue bloods. He cared for vertical integration. He purchased thousands of acres in New Jersey and transformed them into Duke Farms. This was not a garden. It was an engineering marvel. He employed over 2,000 laborers to reshape the very earth. He created 9 man-made lakes. He built 45 miles of stone walls. He installed over 30 fountains, some of which sprayed water dozens of feet into the air. It was a private kingdom, where the rules of nature were secondary to the whims of James Duke. He wanted a view, so he moved a hill. He wanted a lake, so he diverted a river. It was the physical manifestation of a man who believed that enough money could bend the world to his will. His privacy was guarded with a ferocity that bordered on paranoia. He traveled in a private rail car called the Doris. It was a mansion on wheels. It was finished in rare mahogany and plush velvet. It allowed him to move across the continent without ever having to brush shoulders with the common man who funded his lifestyle. He slept in a bed that cost more than a small town in North Carolina. His clothes were hand-tailored. His food was prepared by the finest chefs. Yet, there was a hollow core to the opulence. Duke was a workaholic who saw relaxation as a form of structural weakness. He was a corporate predator who treated his own life as a business asset to be optimized and protected. He had achieved total vertical integration. This is the holy grail of the monopolist. Every time a worker in a factory took a puff of a cigarette, a fraction of a cent traveled through a complex web of holding companies straight into Duke's silk pockets. He didn't just own the tobacco, he owned the machines that rolled it. He owned the paper that wrapped it. He owned the licorice used for flavoring. He even controlled the retail shops that sold it. If a shopkeeper wanted to sell a popular brand, they had to agree to only stock Duke's products. He was a ghost in the machine of American commerce. He was untouchable. He was the personification of the Gilded Age, a period where the gap between the man in the mansion and the man in the factory was a chasm that could never be crossed. But the most terrifying aspect of his wealth was its momentum. By 1905, Duke's net worth was growing at a rate that defied logic. He was no longer just a businessman, he was a sovereign state. He had a $50 million war chest. He used this capital to buy silence, to buy influence, and to buy the competition before they could even pose a threat. He was the king of a silent empire. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to seek the spotlight. He simply owned the air you breathed. He lived in a world where the law was a suggestion and the market was a playground. He believed he had built a monument that would last forever. He believed he was the architect of a new world order, where the corporation was more powerful than the government. He spent his evenings walking through the halls of his fortress, surrounded by art he didn't understand and furniture he rarely sat on. He was a man who had won the game of capitalism, but in doing so, he had become a prisoner of his own success. He was constantly looking over his shoulder. He knew that a monopoly this large was a target. He knew that the public was starting to wake up to the reality of the tobacco trust. He felt the shift in the political wind. But Duke was arrogant. He believed his lawyers were smarter than the Supreme Court. He believed his money was a shield that could deflect any bullet. He was at the absolute peak of his power, looking down on a world that he had conquered through sheer, ruthless will. He was the king of the Gilded Age. But even kings have to face the tax collector. And the tax collector was about to arrive with a hammer. The empire was massive. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And it was starting to crack. Because while Duke was focused on his ledgers, a new breed of politician was rising in Washington. A man who didn't care about Duke's marble halls or his private rail cars. A man who saw the American Tobacco Company not as a success story, but as a cancer on the American economy. The fortress was about to be besieged, and the man inside was about to realize that even a $50 million war chest has its limits. The Gilded Life was about to meet the Progressive era head-on. The problem with owning everything is that you have nowhere left to grow except into the crosshairs of the law. By the first decade of the 20th century, James Duke wasn't just a businessman, he was a target. He had spent 20 years playing a game where he wrote the rules. But the game was about to change. The Progressive era was rising like a storm over the American landscape. A new generation of politicians was looking for a villain to define their movement. They found him in the man who controlled 90% of the tobacco trade. Theodore Roosevelt had a specific, razor-sharp nickname for men like Duke. He called them malefactors of great wealth. To Roosevelt, Duke wasn't a captain of industry. He was a parasite on the American dream. The climate in Washington had turned toxic for the trusts. The public was no longer impressed by the massive mansions or the philanthropic donations. They saw the quote to for what it really was. It was a machine that squeezed the life out of independent farmers in the Carolinas and crushed small shopkeepers in the streets of New York. In 1907, the hammer finally moved. The Department of Justice filed a massive antitrust suit against the American Tobacco Company. They didn't just call it a monopoly. They called it a conspiracy in restraint of trade. The government's lawyers argued that Duke's empire was a predatory beast that had systematically eliminated every shred of competition through illegal means. They pointed to the way he used his $50 million war chest to finance price wars that bankrupted honest men. They documented how he forced retailers into exclusive contracts that made it impossible for any other brand to even reach a shelf. Duke's reaction was pure, unadulterated hubris. He was arrogant. He believed that his lawyers were smarter than the Supreme Court of the United States. He viewed the law as a minor inconvenience, a fence he could simply jump over with enough cash. He hired the most expensive legal minds in the country. He turned the courtrooms into a theater of delays and technicalities. But while his lawyers were arguing over definitions of commerce, the real damage was being done in the court of public opinion. The veil of secrecy began to rip open. Internal memos were leaked to the press. These documents were the smoking guns of a corporate assassin. They showed Duke's cold, systematic plan to destroy any man who dared to stand in his way. One memo detailed how he would track the shipments of small rivals and purposefully flood those specific towns with free samples and below-cost cigarettes until the rival was forced to sell out. It wasn't business, it was industrial warfare. The public mood shifted from curiosity to genuine rage. Even within his own inner circle, the foundation was beginning to fracture. Duke's obsession with total control was a heavy weight. His own family started to show the strain of his relentless pursuit of dominance. He didn't have friends, he had subordinates. He didn't have partners, he had assets. The man who had built an empire on the idea of perfect efficiency was finding that human beings are far more volatile than machines. His brother, Benjamin, who had been his loyal partner for years, began to pull back. The pressure of the federal investigation was turning the Duke household into a fortress of paranoia. The empire was massive, but it was brittle. It was built on a foundation of fear and forced loyalty. As the case climbed its way toward the Supreme Court, Duke sat in his marble mansion on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by gold and silence. He realized that for the first time in his life, he couldn't simply buy his way out of a problem. The government wasn't a competitor he could bankrupt. It was a force of nature. He was an untouchable king who was beginning to realize that the guillotine was being sharpened in the town square. He had achieved vertical integration. He owned the leaf, the paper, the shops, and the very air the smokers breathed. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. In the United States, no one is allowed to be bigger than the system itself. The cracks were no longer just on the surface. They were deep in the core of the American Tobacco Company. The stage was set for a legal execution that would change the face of American capitalism forever. But as the world prepared to watch James Duke fall, he was already preparing his most devious move yet, a move that would turn his ultimate defeat into the greatest payday of his life. In 1911, the hammer finally fell. The Supreme Court of the United States issued a ruling that sent shockwaves through the marble halls of Wall Street. They ordered the total dissolution of the American Tobacco Company. They gave James Duke exactly 6 months to tear apart the empire he had spent 30 years building, leaf by leaf. To the public, it looked like a total execution. The giant had been slain by the sword of justice. But James Duke didn't panic. He didn't even look worried. While his competitors were celebrating and the newspapers were printing his corporate obituary, Duke was sitting in a smoke-filled room with the very government officials who had sued him. This brings us back to that secret document mentioned at the beginning of this story. This wasn't a surrender, it was a blueprint. Duke understood something about power that the politicians didn't. He knew that you can break a window into 1,000 pieces, but every single shard is still made of glass. Duke personally sat down and drew the lines for the new corporate landscape. He didn't let the courts decide how to split his assets. He did it himself. He divided his monopoly into 4 distinct giants: modern-day Reynolds, Liggett and Myers, Lorillard, and a new, smaller version of the American Tobacco Company. On paper, the monopoly was dead. In reality, Duke had just invented the modern oligopoly. Here is the cold, calculated genius of his supposed defeat. By breaking the company up, Duke actually unlocked more wealth than he ever held as a single monopolist. It is a phenomenon known in finance as the sum of the parts being greater than the whole. When the individual companies began to trade on their own, their stock prices skyrocketed. Investors realized that these 4 companies would no longer be weighed down by the massive legal targets on their backs. They were leaner, they were faster, and Duke remained a massive shareholder in every single one of them. He didn't lose his fortune, he simply diversified it under the protection of the very government that tried to destroy him. He turned a legal execution into the greatest payday in American history. The United States government had effectively become his personal collection agency. By supervising the breakup and blessing the new corporate structures, the Department of Justice had essentially guaranteed the future profitability of Duke's holdings. They had given him a clean bill of health. He was no longer a, quote, 3 in the eyes of the law. He was a legitimate industrialist. The, quote, 4 was gone, but the, quote, 5 were born, and they would go on to dominate the lungs of the world for the next century. Duke had outmaneuvered the Supreme Court, the president, and the American people. He had proven that if you are big enough, Even the law becomes a tool for your expansion. But as the dust settled on the restructuring, Duke began to look at his reflection in the marble of his Fifth Avenue mansion. He was 60 years old. He had all the money in the world, but the game of tobacco had lost its thrill. He had mastered the leaf. He had mastered the machine. He had even mastered the law. Now, he wanted something more permanent than smoke. He wanted to own the very lightning that powered the new century. He was about to take the billions he had extracted from the lungs of the poor and plug them into the literal veins of the American South. The monopoly hadn't ended. It was simply changing its form, evolving from a cloud of smoke into a surge of electricity that would power the future of an entire nation. James Duke died in October of 1925, but the machinery of his greed was already immortal. He didn't leave behind a grieving family so much as he left behind a massive, self-sustaining financial engine. In the final decade of his life, he performed the ultimate corporate transmutation. He took the billions of dollars earned from the slow decay of human lungs and funneled them into the roaring rapids of the Catawba River. He saw that the industrialization of the South required more than just cheap labor. It required absolute control over the power grid. He founded Duke Power, known today as Duke Energy. He swapped the addiction of the cigarette for the addiction of the light switch. If you didn't smoke his tobacco, you paid for his electricity. The strategy was flawless. By moving his capital from the volatile world of consumer goods into the protected world of public utilities, Duke ensured his family's wealth would be immune to the shifts of the market. He was no longer a merchant. He was the landlord of the region's infrastructure. But even that wasn't enough to secure his name. Duke understood that history is written by the winners, but it is edited by the philanthropists. In 1924, he established the Duke Endowment with $40 million. He didn't just give the money away, he used it to purchase a legacy. He offered Trinity College a sum so large they couldn't refuse. Change your name to Duke University and the money is yours. It was the ultimate corporate magic trick. With a single stroke of a pen, the, quote, six, who had crushed thousands of small farmers and pioneered the mechanics of addiction, was transformed into a, quote, seven of education and medicine. The blood and soot of the 19th century were scrubbed clean by the ivy-covered walls of the 20th. Today, the Duke name is synonymous with prestige, basketball, and elite research. The cold, calculated mechanics of the American Tobacco Company are a footnote, buried under layers of charitable grants and academic honors. The monopoly was broken by the law, but the influence was cemented by the checkbook. Wealth of this magnitude is never truly lost. It simply changes shape to fit the era. James Duke proved that if you build a big enough cage, the world will eventually pay you for the privilege of living inside it. He mastered the art of the vertical monopoly, the art of the legal loophole, and the art of the historical pivot. From the dirt of a North Carolina farm to the heights of global finance, his life was a masterclass in the ruthless acquisition of power. He didn't just own the market, he owned the air, the light, and eventually, the very way we remember him. But the patterns he established didn't die with him. The tactics of the American Tobacco Company, the predatory pricing, the total control of the supply chain, the buying of the public mind, are the same tactics used by the tech titans and energy giants of today. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The next James Duke is already building his empire, and he is likely using the same blueprint that was drafted in a smoke-filled room in 1911. If you want to know where the money is going, you have to look at who is building the cages. To understand the future of the global economy, you must understand the ghosts of the Gilded Age. Subscribe to follow the money. James Duke died in October 1925. He left behind a fortune of over $100 million and a wake of destruction that reshaped the American landscape. But the truly chilling part of his end wasn't the money he left. It was how he laundered his reputation before the dirt even hit his casket. He spent his final years obsessed with immortality, not the spiritual kind. He wanted the kind of immortality that only a massive endowment and a name carved in granite can buy. He looked at his piles of tobacco money and saw a blood stain. He spent the rest of his life turning that blood into philanthropy. In 1924, 1 year before his death, he established the Duke Endowment with $40 million. It was one of the largest private foundations in the world. He didn't just give the money away, he used it to transform Trinity College into Duke University. He bought a legacy. He ensured that for centuries to come, the name Duke would be associated with higher learning, medicine, and spiritual growth, rather than the aggressive addiction of millions. He understood a fundamental truth of the Gilded Age. If you give enough money to a university or a hospital, the world will eventually forget where that money came from. They will stop seeing the smoke and start seeing the marble. But the money didn't just vanish into schools. It moved into the very wires that power your home. James Duke was a visionary of infrastructure. He realized long before his competitors that the South needed more than just a way to burn leaves. It needed power. He used his tobacco billions to buy up water rights across the Piedmont region of North Carolina and South Carolina. He founded the Southern Power Company, which we now know as Duke Energy. It is a multi-billion-dollar titan that still dominates the American utility sector today. He traded a monopoly on what people put in their mouths for a monopoly on the light in their rooms. It was the ultimate pivot. He moved from the lungs of the poor to the grids of the growing middle class. The wealth of the Duke family became an invisible ghost in the American economy. It is a fortune built on a foundation of ruthless litigation, price fixing, and the exploitation of small farmers. Yet, today, the Duke family is spoken of in the hushed, respectful tones reserved for old world royalty. They are the old money archetype. They are the patrons of the arts and the saviors of the sick. This is the ultimate corporate magic trick. James Duke proved that a monopoly doesn't have to die. It just has to change its clothes. He took a predatory business model and dressed it in the robes of a benefactor. When you look at the modern landscape of tech giants and data monopolies, you are looking at the children of James Duke. The tactics have changed, but the mechanics remain identical. Control the supply chain. Crush the competition through predatory pricing. Lobby the government until they become your partner. And when the public finally turns on you, give just enough back to make them feel guilty for hating you. James Duke didn't just build a tobacco empire. He built the blueprint for the modern corporate god. He proved that if you build a big enough cage, the world will eventually pay you for the privilege of living inside it. The autopsy of this empire reveals a dark reality about the American dream. It is rarely a story of hard work and fair play. It is a story of who can endure the most cold-blooded decisions. It is a story of who can weaponize the law and who can silence the loudest critics. James Duke died in a bed that cost more than most towns, leaving behind a world that was literally addicted to his products and dependent on his power. He won. He beat the government, he beat his rivals, and he beat time itself. His name is everywhere, but his methods are hidden in the fine print of history. Wealth of this magnitude is never truly lost. It just changes shape. It flows from tobacco to electricity, from electricity to endowments, and from endowments into the very fabric of society. If you want to know how the next generation of monopolies is being built right under your nose, you need to look at the patterns. You need to look at the men who aren't afraid to be called villains today so they can be called saints tomorrow. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And the rhyme of the Duke family is a warning, written in gold and smoke. If you want to stay ahead of the game, you have to follow the money, even when it leads into the dark. Subscribe to keep your eyes open.